Welcome everybody to the sixth offering in our Scholars in the Square series. I'm really pleased to see people here in person, on Zoom, and in the future through YouTube. Now, this approach is probably still new to some folks, so I should say that after a 20-minute talk by Julian Evans, Dr. James Rowe from our Environmental Studies Department will join me and Julian for 20 minutes of conversation. And then we'll spend the last 20 minutes in a broader discussion with people in the room and with people on Zoom. Our speaker today is Julian Evans, who was a visiting fellow at the CSRS last year, and whose work fascinated us so much that we invited him to come and share his work with us in the series. Julian is working on a PhD at Western University. He completed his MA here in 2016. He's currently an instructor in the Environmental Studies Department, before which he was an instructor at VIU. In addition to being a teacher and scholar, he's also both a bird watcher and a DJ. And I feel like we're going to hear and be able to experience some of his many selves today. Now, Julian's going to introduce us to someone of whom Foucault said he plays against his own culture with his own culture. Given Julian's interest in Bachelard and ecological kinship, I think that his work helps us to acknowledge and respect the Lakota peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Salish peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming Julian.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the CSRS for inviting me to speak today. So the title of my talk, again, is Deep Listening and the Animist Imaginary. Since beginning my time researching and working at the CSRS in the spring and summer, I wanted very much to speak more about animism and the philosopher Gaston Bachelard. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So this work emerges out of a chapter of my dissertation, which explores the cosmology of Bachelard that he develops through his kind of poetic meditations upon the ancient elements, earth, fire, air, and water. My basic premise of this chapter is that, as Bachelard suggests, if we are attentive to the experience of imagining and to the cultural imaginary that results, we find this experience involves the very active participation of the non-human world, including but not limited to elements, plants, and animals. Bachelard is in part original in the methods he employs to make these arguments because he practices a form of deep listening. He does not use this phrase as such in his works, but this is the way, my way of characterizing the attention his works play to the dynamics of sound and to the role that listening plays in disrupting habits of perception. Okay, so what is deep listening? I use the term deep listening to refer to a practice which intends to heighten and expand the consciousness of sound in as many dimensions of awareness as humanly possible. This is a quote from the visionary composer and early pioneer of electronic music, Pauline Oliveros. For Oliveros, deep listening is only possible through consciousness, understood for her as acting with awareness, presence, and memory. The deep of deep listening, Oliveros writes, has to do with complexity and boundaries, or edges beyond ordinary and habitual understandings. Learning to expand the perception of sounds to include the whole space-time continuum. Deep listening is always concerned with the edges of one's field of awareness and how attention to edges can create expansion. So just push the button. Field recording, the practice of using a portable device to listen and to record, was a method Oliveros championed for studying the mixed sonic qualities of one's home place. She was endlessly curious about the pulses and rhythms one encounters in everyday life throughout urban and natural environments. Oliveros believes that the polyrhythmic textures of everyday life were enhanced by direct, unmediated, and focused listening. But this did not mean ignoring the endless permutations that sound undergoes through recording, broadcast, and expression in communications technologies. In her essay, Quantum Listening, Oliveros speculates on how we might listen to more than one reality simultaneously. She goes on to say that deep listening evolves as a lifelong practice, carried along by the mantra, listen to everything all the time and remind yourself when you are not listening. We listen in order to interpret our world and experience meaning, she writes, and further, that our world is a complex matrix of vibrating energy, matter, and air, just as we are made of vibrations. Vibration connects us with all beings and connects us to all things interdependently. Deep listening was for Oliveros a force for personal, spiritual, and especially social change. She had an acute awareness of non-human animals as the original deep listeners. Oliveros writes that birds and insects were listening to humans with complete and total attention because the presence of human beings brings the possibility of life and death. Listening can be the difference between life and death. Listening is survival. While deep listening is a set of practices and techniques that can be honed by an individual, the exercises and training that Oliveros outlines in her books are largely collective and group experiments. Deep listening shifts continuously from a personal project of attentive perception to a social practice of expanding one's understanding of the needs, desires, and expressions of others. So for deep listening to be truly understood, it must be practiced. To pay homage to Oliveros, I would like to experiment with one of her simple exercises that should only take a few minutes. In her book, Deep Listening, she offers this exercise for a group that is gathered together for any purpose, with the advice only that each person try to answer this question in a new way. We are together because. We are together because. So I invite someone to finish this sentence. We are together because.
We value learning.
We are together because.
We want to focus our attention together.
We are together because.
I found the room.
We are together because.
We're curious.
We are together because.
It feels like a responsibility.
We are together because. We want to share. We are together because.
We learn from each other.
We are together because.
We want to be supportive.
We are together because. And so Oliveros wrote that we hear best with the ears of others. And so hopefully this brief experiment with one of her group practices has attuned us a little more towards listening in a new way. And of course, I think any discussion of deep listening will be incomplete without actually listening to one of her musical compositions. So I present here a short excerpt from a collaboration entitled Quartet for the End of Space. The piece is mixed with a field recording I made very recently, the story of which we can return to in the discussion. Oh, sorry. Volume just needs to be a little bit. We tested this many times.
Of course we did.
There it is. It's fine.
Yeah.
so what do I mean by the animist imaginary? The term animism unfortunately carries with it the baggage of an anthropological tradition, which used the term pejoratively to describe how primitive peoples imagined that everything had within it a soul, and that this represented a failure to understand the absolute difference between humans and all others. Animism is then still often defined as the belief that all things, animals, plants, rocks, rivers, weather systems, human artifacts, stories, and songs are alive. However, next one. The notable scholar of religion, Graham Harvey, defines the term differently. Animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Rather than soul, life, or spirit, the key term in Harvey's work is person or personhood. Harvey studies the way animism has taken on a new life in the works of environmental philosophers, eco-pagan activists, as well as contemporary Indigenous writers. In my view, the preeminent philosopher of contemporary animism is the Australian anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose, who endorses the definition of animism suggested by Harvey. Her work calls us into profound and existential meditation upon the character of human-animal relations, as well as the fundamental kinship human beings have for all of existence. Bird-Rose returns again and again to mystery and uncertainty as fundamental principles of her worldview. In this, we can hear the echo of Oliveros' concern for the edges to which the practice of deep listening brings us towards. She pursued a lifelong project of bringing Western philosophy into dialogue with the worldviews of Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples. The final source I mentioned in regards to my understanding of animism is David Abram. It's one of the only books I've had to buy a new copy of because it wore through it so much. Abram suggests that the description of the planet as a coherent living entity by the scientists Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock in the early 80s constituted a radical break in our understanding of both the meaning of subjectivity and the Earth itself. In 1985, he wrote that perception was always involved and intertwined with the animate Gaian vision of the Earth expressed by Lovelock and Margulis. In his 1996 book, The Spell of the Sensuous, he further develops the dialogue between Gaian science, the tradition of phenomenology, and oral place-based cultures. Each of these, in its own fashion, he thought, had an understanding of the enveloping and sensuous Earth as the dwelling place for the living body. This cosmology adheres around the central premise of his book. We are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human. So this brief discussion of animism gives us the context and background for what I am calling Bachelard's animist imaginary. For those unfamiliar with Bachelard, he was a French philosopher concerned with the study of poetics and what he called the material or dynamic imagination. He understood the imagination to be governed by the laws of the four ancient elements: fire, water, air, and earth. For my purposes today, the central animating question or philosophical problem of Bachelard seems to me to be this: how is it possible that new images take hold of our imagination? The ecstatic newness of images had him perpetually perplexed. To try and unravel this state of perplexity, Bachelard distinguishes the formal from the material imagination. The formal sense of imagination is the mind's capacity to form images that are absent from perceptual experience. I can imagine the peanut butter sandwich I ate for breakfast, even though it is not still here with me. The material or dynamic imagination is something different. I think it shares much in common with the animistic worldview that I outlined earlier. In Bachelard's studies of how the imagination relates to the four ancient elements, he comes to suggest that this faculty of mind to form images is only one aspect of what we mean by imagination. It cannot account for the birth of new poetic images. There is therefore another sense to imagination as a dynamic activity that deforms what we perceive. We are able to witness this directly, Bachelard believes, through the dreams and reveries which arise in the actual encounter with the elements of fire, water, air, and earth. This sense of imagination is therefore not only personal or individual, not only, got my slides here, that's Bachelard and his famous book, Poetics of Space. This sense of imagination is therefore not only personal or individual, not only an image which the mind possesses or has a hold of. Bachelard's originality as a thinker, I believe, comes from the way he conceptualizes imagination as a dynamic flow, a kind of cosmic energy that minds participate with. Novelty arrives from participation in the animate imagining of the universe, and it is through learning new forms of relation and receptivity that poets, artists, philosophers, and scientists equally embrace this imaginary. This is why, in the Poetics of Space, Bachelard's, his most widely read book in the English-speaking world, Bachelard begins with an attention to reverberation. Poetic images emerge and reverberate, and if one can learn to listen deeply to this reverberation throughout and across cultures, one can begin to sense the way the cosmos is not a cold, empty, and absurd place. Instead, Bachelard holds to the premise that being itself is the incessant birthing of newness through images, that the universe is brimming with the force of the imaginary, and that this imaginary flows through human works. As this imaginary flows through human works, Bachelard argues we need new ways of listening to its reverberation. Bachelard enigmatically writes that through listening, one can encounter the sonority or the tonality of being. This assertion, I would argue, bears much in common with the deep and quantum listening that I discussed at the beginning. The philosophers Jean-Luc Nancy and Christophe Cox have also made recent inquiries into this ontology of sound, highlighting the fundamental reciprocity of the listening subject. Cox argues that noise, if we attend to its philosophical meaning, is not merely unwanted sound, but the inexhaustible background condition from which all sound emerges. Let us attempt then to hold on to this sense of sound and let that inform how we listen differently or deeply to this next sound collage. Bachelard's philosophy of listening comes out of his concern for the phenomenological dimension of sonic environments. His work demonstrates how listening can become a mode of inhabiting spaces and places. Listening for Bachelard forms a fundamental aspect of the human condition. While listening is only one dimension of embodied sense perception, Bachelard is highly attentive to the power of listening, in particular to awaken, to return us to new dimensions of the present moment through, again, disrupting perceptual habits. I had a bit more, but I think I'm running out of time, so I want to play one last recording. So the last soundscape composition I played was oriented around this surprise encounter I had with a Cooper's hawk and this kind of battle between the crows and the hummingbirds that I witnessed on the walkway near my house. And so this one final deep listening exercise is based upon this kind of dialogue between two woodpeckers from very different places, and we can talk more about that. There's
See the woodpecker? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the next part of the conversation for today is going to be between the three of us. And I'm just here to lubricate the discussion a little bit and to add my own if that seems appropriate. But why don't you begin?
Cool. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, really lovely to be here with you all. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for that wonderful presentation, Julian. So I had to give the disclaimer when I got invited to do this that I have never read the Poetics of Space, and so don't have fine knowledge of Bachelard, and so can't dig in there. Maybe I would just start with the point you made near the end there about how he really saw, he was attuned to all the other senses as being powerful for awakening, but had maybe a special place in his heart for listening. But curious, obviously the deep awareness can manifest through our entire sensorium, sight, touch, taste. And so what is it about listening that should command our attention? I guess what's unique about listening, or is it just that that present level of awareness can again manifest through all the senses, and listening is one of our few and powerful senses. Mm-hmm. That's enough.
Yeah, in one paper I wrote for a conference, I kind of had this discussion about how it's not just listening, it's how listening can kind of extend and kind of bring us into a more full-bodied awareness of that of all the senses, but there is something about listening which it seems to have this power to awaken, as he said, this power to do that, to open us, to be more receptive, more have a kind of more felt encounter. And so it seems it's not necessarily the only way that can happen, but there is something powerful about listening, about sound that has this kind of this power to make us more aware, and particularly more aware of environments, of ecologies. Mm-hmm. And then I think one of the other things that Bachelard is quite attentive to, and one of the things that's come up in other research I've done, is this kind of ephemeral character of sound, right? That sound is always disappearing, right? That like what Pauline Oliveros was saying about, practice this mantra of listening to sound disappearing, and where does sound stop? Where does your memory begin? If you're attentive to that edge, it has this kind of expansive role. And so I think the fact that sound is in time, right? That it connects us to this kind of process, that it's always disappearing, but that also it's generative, right? It's like sound is, to reference the work of this biologist I've been really engaged with, David Haskell. He talks really about that we can kind of uncover interesting things about the kind of deep past of sound, and that if you look at the kind of the beginning of sound in the evolutionary kind of record, that it's this moment of great kind of genesis, when life became able to communicate across distances. This was a really kind of generative moment, and I think that deep kind of history of sound speaks to like why sound or why listening.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting to me, just personally, I'm just reflecting that when I sit and do my sort of deep awareness practice of meditation, I typically wear earplugs. But it's interesting because in a certain way, like I'm blocking out ambient sound to be able to heighten present level awareness. But there's times when I'm putting in my earplugs that I actually then can sort of feel and hear my heartbeat in my ear in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. And we don't typically think of our inner organism as a soundscape. But I like what you've just said, is that it helps me think about the sound of my inner organism, which I've never considered before. Gushing liquids and fluids that we're comprised of, and the beating of the heart, of course, the rhythm of the heart. And anyway, so that's interesting that for me personally, to think about me putting earplugs in is actually facilitating a form of deep listening, but an internal kind of internal listening. So
one of the, if I could jump in, one of my favorite stories about Oliveros is her kind of riffing off this famous story that's told by John Cage, where he went into this like vacuum sealed room where there was supposed to be kind of no sound, and he immediately heard the sound of his own heartbeat, and like what he says is like was like an overpowering sound of blood in his veins, right? And that's kind of the story that's told. And then Oliveros has this kind of elaboration on the story that she tells in one of her books, which is that he actually later died of a heart attack, that he may have been hearing like arteries that were not functioning well, and hearing this like clogged, like not flowing well blood. And so if he had kind of been more attuned or aware of the differences that blood makes flowing through the body, he could have kind of been attentive to his own health in that way, which is just a riff off what you're saying.
I just to continue the riff, but you mentioned the sort of intensity that Cage, and this may have been because he had heart failure, but the sort of intense feeling or the sound of the heart. But I'm just interested in the mobilization of deep listening as a practice that from having read some of your previous work, like you're interested in as a way of helping people connect to the more than human world and enhance restoration projects. And so doing, we kind of got a hint at that with some of these soundscapes here. In my experience of like deep awareness of any kind, whether it's deep listening or deep touch or whatever else, that you do touch in to an intensity. Like there is a intensity to life. All life is powered by the superabundance of solar energy bestowed upon us, and when we take time to sit quietly, we're in that immensity, we're in that exuberance. And on the one hand, it can be lovely, but on the other hand, there's a kind of an overflow. And there's a reason why there's so much internal conscious and unconscious resistance to being still. Because when we're still, we're forced to sort of be with the immensity of existence, which carries with it challenges around its fleetingness and everything else. But I'm just curious, I think a challenge that all of us face who are wanting these deep contemplative practices to proliferate throughout the culture is that people resist. and so I'm curious what your thoughts are around that resistance, what your experiences is with that resistance, and then how some of these practices might actually facilitate short-circuiting some of that resistance. 'Cause, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, definitely there, I resisted a lot at the beginning, and it was kind of a combination of learning some mindfulness techniques and just a real curiosity around the communicative capacities of birds in particular, which kind of had me going out and sitting in the same place day after day and being able to sit there quietly for longer and longer. In terms of the resistance, I mean, that's got me puzzled a bit. I think what's interesting about Oliveros is that it's not always only the contemplative individual, deep listening. She values that. She says it's really important part of the practice, but for her, it was this kind of lifelong project of organizing these group kind of collaborations and experiments. And so I think one of the ways to short circuit that is like that that exercise that I tried to throw in the middle there, like ways of making these practices more social, more collective, more active. So I think the stillness is so valuable, and encountering that intensity you're talking about, like really heightens or helps us to have a kind of environmental ecological awareness. But yeah, maybe the entry point is more social and collective forms of these practices. Yeah.
Well, maybe from that, I wonder if there's any experiences you can share from the work that you've already been doing in community with bird call in particular. Like, what have you seen that's promising in terms of the capacity for these kinds of social deep listening practices in the more than human world as a way of facilitating deeper connectivity?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I do a lot of work in community, but this last slide here, I put this up because this was at the conference I presented at in July in Colorado, and I gave the paper. Wasn't totally on this subject, but adjacent to it, and everyone was so curious about the few little recordings I played that they wanted to go out and listen to this soundscape in a different way. So I just kind of took out my microphones there and like told some stories and talked about my approach, and then we just kind of I did like an impromptu sound walked around the trails and the kind of mountain, and then listened really carefully, and then people got to listen like through the microphones, and I think that always kind of awakens a bit of a wonder or a curiosity, and so I'm really trying to kind of, it's still in the works and not hasn't kind of borne fruit yet, but I'm trying to kind of work that into community sound walks that explore like sites of ecological restoration, because I think that these sites, like all of the recordings, I'm pretty sure that I played for you, were kind of made in these places that I visited, that I found myself returning to again and again, because they had interesting, fascinating soundscapes, and they kind of were on this like edge or border between the urban and the natural world. And there's something I just find so fascinating about that edge and that kind of in between zone. And so I think, what I want to, the kind of like my next part of this project is to do more of these community sound walks, but drawing people's awareness or interest into these sites of urban ecological restoration.
Is there something also subversive in that act, in paying attention to sound, especially in that borderline between the, as you said, suburban and natural? Although that's a strange juxtaposition, because it's all human made at this point, right? And in other words, we've decided that over there we're going to let the trees grow without cutting them down.
Yeah, but the trees and the birds and the animals have some agency there too. I think we try more to intervene in ways that allows a kind of non-human agency to flourish. And sure, it's not the same as maybe a wilderness area where there's grizzly bears, but the I think those agencies or those agencies matter too. It's good. But yeah, in terms of the first part, is there something subversive? I hope so. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think the proliferation of those kinds of spaces where it's not only about us, it's not just about, the needs of humans, where we try and work and challenge that anthropocentrism, right? I think that can be subversive, or it can be the kind of the gateway into a broader form of subversion, maybe.
I've got another riff.
Yeah, go ahead.
But there's this like sort of parable in the Buddhist world around, wanting to find peace and quiet in the city, and you can't because it's like the bus going by or whatever. It's really hard to meditate, and so you like finally get out to the retreat center, and you're like, oh, like finally I'm gonna have peace and quiet. And then the birds are so fucking loud. but it just got me thinking that like obviously in an urban environment there's so much noise, pollution, and that's something that more and more people are thinking about. But with the like teeming biodiversity that we have, sort of, I'm using the we generally, but that industrial capital society has systematically denuded, that a lot of sounds are obviously been dulled from the more than human world. But like the stories of like passenger pigeons that have been rendered extinct, of like blotting out the sky for days, just billions and billions. It must have been so loud. And so it's interesting to reflect how loud the world may have been prior to industrialization. There's ways that the urban might be quieter. But it also has me thinking about some of the within animistic cultures, there's obviously a cosmology that connects people to that effusion, and there's reciprocal kinship relations with that effusion in that more than human world. But there's a certain way I could see a move towards human supremacies around like, shut the fuck up. I want some peace and quiet, and extirpation is obviously the ultimate silencing, but it just has me thinking that some human exceptional anxiety being disturbed by the utter cacophony of the more than human in teeming biodiverse conditions that that were extant before industrial capitalism. So anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. The first piece that I played, it's like this. I really wanted to like just kind of mix or combine some recording I had made in this really recent session where I just kind of went out early in the morning. I had like just an hour before a bunch of other stuff to do. I went to this place, the Matson Conservation Area, which is right by my house. And I'm always just like, anytime there's a woodpecker drumming, I'm like immediately attracted to that, and I try and get as close to the woodpecker as I can and make some recording of the woodpecker. But in that first recording, like most, what I became drawn to as I listened to it over a few times was this moment where there's like the siren, and there's a Buick's wren that's like alarming, and there's like all this other kind of cacophonous stuff going on, and it's kind of like represents that struggle almost, right? Like going away into this kind of ecologically sensitive, protected kind of area and looking for the kind of non-human, more than human sounds, and wanting to like record some of that, but like all I could hear was this kind of human noise. But then when I layered it with that Oliveros track, which is like not a pleasant track to listen to, it's like a really kind of challenging, experimental kind of piece. There was something about that moment with the sirens and stuff. It seemed to like work and line up really well. And so yeah, it's just my most recent creative output. And there's something about, I don't know, there's something about listening to that kind of cacophonous, it's almost like that intensity you're talking about, like listening to those difficult, like complex, overwhelming sounds I find in a group, like with others, part of a presentation, it somehow is, I don't know, cathartic, or it just, I find it fascinating. And I'm interested in returning to that. And I think that speaks somewhat to what you're talking about, but yeah.
So now let's all join the table again, and now we can have a larger conversation with Zoom people as well as the other folks in the room. So thanks very much, Jane. That was great. Who has a question?
So you started to get to this right at the end there, but I'd be interested to hear you say more about. So my perception was that the idea of tuning into more to sound draws us closer to nature, makes us more aware and alert when we're in nature and more connected to nature, and maybe also has implications for how we treat nature. And so the thing I was curious about is how the more manufactured soundtracks that aren't just simply nature, what the goal is of those, and maybe there doesn't necessarily have to be a goal, which would be an okay answer too, but like I guess why not just listen to recordings of nature?
Yeah.
What else are you getting out of adding the other sounds in?
Yeah, I think for me it's like it has to do with kind of memory and this guy I just took a workshop with, Lawrence English. He talks about this kind of what's interesting about field recording is this way that you kind of are able to have a listening be listened to, right? So you're kind of the creative, the thing that makes it creative is that you can kind of give to others this kind of moment or this kind of time when you are like intensely listening. And so why I put all that other stuff in is because it like when I go out and make recordings, like that's mostly what I'm hearing. I'm walking from my house, or there's all this kind of interference, and there's stuff that happens after. Like I saw the hawk, and then I wandered through town and like went and had lunch at this restaurant in the mall, and I just still had my recorder, and I just kind of kept capturing little sounds as I go. And there's something about that makes it more in tune with my memory of the day and of the time. And like there was still that the reason I like that recording so much of the hawk is that you can also hear in the background there's these shorebirds, and then there's this crow making this kind of strange communication call that I don't quite understand, but I've never captured very well, and it's like in the background of that recording. And so I think that I put all that other stuff in because to me it's more kind of about this reality of that we go from our urban lives into these like places of kind of relative wildness, and then we have to go back again, and that something about I think there's something interesting to me about that kind of listening, and it seems to be, I don't know, it seems to like help the memory more when all that other kind of stuff is included, rather than if it's just the recording outside of that context. I don't know.
I wonder too if I'm thinking about subversion, and are you thinking about subverting kind of how sound can be aestheticized? Like how does aesthetics kind of fit into this? And and then I did make the typical scholarly sin of answering my own question in my question. Do aesthetics help us redistance ourselves from a perceived truth or perceived reality, right? So the effort is more about opening up our awareness to push further that way and not kind of jump up into theory. Where does that factor in?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thanks, Jessica. I think Yeah, I think part of the thing that's interesting to me is that I don't really know why I'm doing this. And then it's like, and then I like
Sort it out before your defense. And as defense, one might ask that.
But like like that was such a great question about like, whoa, you got all this other sounds in there. Like, what's that about? And then it's like, oh yeah, why do I do that? And so I think it's an aesthetic choice, and I think it's about this kind of maybe over aestheticized culture that we live in terms of like nature recordings, or like I read this article about how they play birdsong in gas stations in the UK to like calm people down, because they're like, it's like in the middle of their like hectic travel, and they want like that when they're at the gas station for them to be like calm or something. So I think, yeah, it's like, we for one to have like that when I was talking about that like transmitting of the listening to a listening, right? Like that is, I think, what gives field recording or sound recordings like this, like their kind of power. And so if you get this sense that I'm like that one is like able to hear and kind of perceive this vast kind of like wonder and fascinating kind of aesthetic kind of joy, and then it's like in the middle of all this chaos and noise. I think that's maybe more like honest or something. Yeah.
Great.
There's a Zoom question.
Oh, great.
It's a big one. Feels like a big philosophical question to me from Greg Horn. I don't know if that's a familiar name or not.
Yeah.
So question, if we could take it all in at once, what would the entire universe sound like? Said differently, if the genesis of literally everything we know is captured in terms of a sound, the Big Bang, then what does that everything sound like now?
I don't know how to answer that, but I love the question. I mean, David Haskell has this really great thing about like how that the Big Bang there wasn't actually sound, and then but that like soon after there was this ways in which the kind of cosmic unfolding of particles like being attracted to each other like kind of began the moment of sound. So I think I think that's something that I was gesturing towards about this idea that like noise, it's not just unwanted sound, but that that silence is always relative, right? There's always some kind of sound, and that we can only kind of exist in those moments like between it in terms of a silence, right? What would the sound of all the universe be? I think it really escapes our capacity to imagine or to comprehend. But I think people like this, the collaboration I put from Pauline Oliveros, it was with this guy Francisco Lopez, and I feel like that is really the question that his work kind of goes to, and he really is like constructing these moments where that kind of unending like wall of noise creates a kind of a condition for like a transcendent moment, or a really kind of spiritual overwhelming kind of encounter with whatever that is the sound of everything.
It's funny that was a great question, and I wonder if you had been asked this question and you weren't Julian Evans, but you were a person trained in philosophy from the Indian tradition, there would be a very straightforward answer to that question. There wouldn't, and in fact, the question probably wouldn't be posed, but the answer is obviously Om. That's not a metaphor. It is the actual sound of the way the universe actually is. And I don't know, maybe you want to jump in here as a person with a deep Buddhist practice.
I like where you're going.
Partly I feel like I have a contractual obligation to, introduce capital R religious content into the conversation. But in some sense, it's there already. But it does seem to me that that's the That's the kind of obvious go-to answer that
Yeah.
might in some ways, even stick in your analysis. Because in some sense, what you're recovering by this deep listening process is that capacity just to experience the universe as sound, not the sound of the universe, but the universe as sound.
Yeah, I will remember Om as for the next time someone asks me that question.
Riley.
Yeah, that's not a question, so I won't try and pretend that it is. It's just an observation. That following on James's point about the kind of soundscape of internal organs in the womb, the decibel level is like 85, right? People know that? And we sort of think the womb is silent, but actually it's very loud, which is why when you're trying to comfort a baby, like you play loud white noise or put on a hairdryer or something like that. So I wonder if that's connected to our like fetishizing silence and wanting nature to be silent, that we have this idea that that's kind of how we started, but actually we started with noise. So it's kind of inherent in being human that we have a capacity to handle noise, or maybe even like a bit of a thirst for it that you're tapping into a bit as like more primal or more of a precognitive experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating. And I mean, when you start looking into noise and like what makes something noise versus a signal or versus, what we're listening for, it's so subjective. And like some people love noise, right? It's a whole genre of music. And, and that's interesting. You said 85, thanks for that information. Because that's when you're, mastering music, you have this thing where you try to get your speakers to be at like a precise level, and that's around 85. And it's like it's not something I do a lot of, but I remember I did like a treatment once where you like set it to like a level and you like record the level so that you can get back there all the time, so that that like whatever you're working on will sound good on other systems and stuff, right? And it's like about that level. So there is kind of like a warm region that we gravitate back to. That's really fascinating. Yeah.
And also when we do palliative care in the hospital, that's another thing we're taught is that sound is usually the last sense to go. So it's a way you can still reach people even when their other senses are no longer available to them. So it's sort of with us right from the beginning, and then often like right to the very, very end.
Yeah, and we're also kind of like losing it as we go through too. Like the sounds that children can hear are way higher frequency than like all of us, right? And many people like lose that high frequency range or are losing it, so it's interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Only if there's nobody else.
Or George, I looked like you were cooking up a question. Matt.
I guess, so in response to your last answer, it feels like a little bit of what you were saying too is you're trying to tell a story with those recordings, maybe when you're incorporating your whole day into them.
Yeah.
But that's just a comment. Another question is, so I'm trying to compare what you do to what biologists do. And so I think a biologist would say, we enjoy nature and we go out and we study nature and we try to understand it better. And it feels very similar to what you're doing, except you're approaching it from a slightly different discipline, and a different angle.
Yeah.
I think many biologists these days would also say we need to understand nature better so that we can conserve it and we can make people more aware. So that also sounds very similar to what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I guess as a biologist, I'm curious what else you would add to that in terms of going beyond just biology. Like, what is your discipline or your field or your realm?
Yeah.
Add to these sort of more basic kind of biological components.
Yeah, I mean, I think biology, can only tell us so much about value, right? And so and history, right? Like human history, and that's what makes the story compelling, right? I agree. There's a way of kind of telling a story, and when we listen, this is Oliveros's big point, right? Like listening is this kind of unfinished task that we kind of work at our entire lives, and we can always kind of improve at it. We can always listen in new ways, and yet we bring all of our baggage and our histories to that listening, right? And so, I think that I'm immensely curious about biology and trying to understand how the sound recordings are this indicator of ecosystem health. I find all of that stuff so fascinating, but I think I see my role in terms of like coming from a background in philosophy and being very interested in political theory and kind of a broader kind of humanities approach. I think it's like, how does that connection or that awareness you're talking about, right? Like people connecting to the natural world, like what are the kind of what's the cultural kind of way that we can expand that awareness, expand and kind of make it more salient, right? And that involves like telling good stories or a kind of story that is not a story that's been heard before, right? And that is complex, and it involves that kind of honesty, I think, that I was talking about, and the kind of exploration and kind of experimentation, and that's what I get from the artist's work.
That's a great last question, I'm afraid. Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you very much, Julian. Next week, and Stone. So it's not the same time, same place. It's a different time and different place, but it is still part of our broader public offering. So see you next week, 3rd of November at noon. So we'll see you then. Take care, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you.